A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey everyone, welcome back to my weird prompts. We are sitting here in our living room in Jerusalem, and I have to say, looking out at the streets here, you really get a sense of how central language is to the human experience. You hear Hebrew, Arabic, English, Russian, French, all within a single block. It is a constant reminder that the world is a very noisy, very diverse place. It is like the Tower of Babel never really fell. It just got a lot more interesting.
It really is, Corn. And I am Herman Poppleberry, by the way. It is good to be back in the chairs. You know, our housemate Daniel sent us a prompt this morning that actually fits perfectly with that observation. He was asking about polyglots, those rare individuals who seem to collect languages like some people collect stamps or vintage coins. It is a fascinating prompt because it touches on the very core of what makes us human, our ability to encode the entire universe into sounds and symbols.
It is a timely topic too. We are living in March of 2026, an era where large language models have become so sophisticated that real-time translation earbuds are almost a standard accessory for travelers. The technical barrier to understanding someone from another culture is supposedly vanishing. You can just tap a button and hear a synthetic voice tell you what the person across from you is saying. But there is still something deeply impressive, almost superhuman, about a person who can just switch their entire internal operating system from one language to another on the fly, without any silicon assistance.
It is the difference between a calculator and a mathematician. One is a tool, the other is an embodied skill. There is a certain language instinct we all have, but polyglots are like the elite athletes of that instinct. They treat syntax like a playground rather than a hurdle. Daniel wanted us to look into whether these people have fundamentally different brains, what the actual cognitive limits are for the rest of us, and some of the more surprising historical figures who pulled this off.
Right, because for most of us, learning just one second language is a massive, multi-year struggle that often ends in being able to order a coffee and not much else. I remember trying to learn French in school, and it felt like my brain was trying to chew on gravel. But then you have these hyper-polyglots who seem to inhale grammar. So, Herman, where do we even draw the line? At what point do you stop being a bilingual or trilingual person and start being a hyper-polyglot?
Generally, the consensus in linguistics is that the threshold for a hyper-polyglot is 6 or more languages at a high level of proficiency. Some people use the term polyglot for anyone who speaks more than 3, but the hyper-polyglots are the true outliers. And there is an important distinction to make right at the start between active and passive fluency. You might meet someone who says they know 20 languages, but they might only be able to read 10 of them or hold a basic conversation in 5. The real mystery is the person who can function professionally and deeply in a dozen or more.
That makes sense. It is the depth that matters. I am curious if this is a specific talent, like being born with a certain height for basketball, or if it is just a very specific type of obsession and strategy. When we look at the neurobiology, what is actually happening in the brain of someone who has mastered, say, 10 different ways to describe the world? Is their hardware different, or are they just running better software?
That is where the research gets really interesting. For a long time, people thought polyglots just had better memories, like they had a bigger hard drive. But modern neuroimaging tells a much more nuanced story. If you look at the brain of a high-level polyglot, you see significant differences in the executive control network. This is the part of the brain responsible for managing attention, switching between tasks, and suppressing irrelevant information.
So it is less about what they are remembering, and more about what they are able to ignore. Like, when they want to speak Hebrew, they have to turn off the English and the French.
Precisely. Think about it this way. When you speak English, your brain has to actively inhibit every other language you know so they do not leak into your sentences. For a polyglot, that inhibition task is massive. They have multiple competing linguistic schemas fighting for the microphone. Research shows that polyglots often have increased white matter integrity and a higher density of gray matter in the left inferior parietal cortex. This area is heavily involved in language processing and switching. It is like they have built a more robust switchboard to handle the traffic.
That is fascinating. We actually touched on the flip side of this back in episode 7099 when we talked about language attrition. We discussed how the brain is very efficient at pruning away neural pathways that are not being used. If you stop using a language, the brain eventually reclaims that real estate for something else. It is the use it or lose it principle on a cellular level. So, for a polyglot, they are essentially fighting a constant war against their own brain's desire to be efficient.
That is a great connection, Korn. The metabolic cost of maintaining those pathways is high. Your brain is a calorie-hungry organ consuming about 20% of your body's energy despite being only 2% of its weight. Maintaining the synaptic connections for 5 or 6 different grammatical structures is a heavy lift. This is why many hyper-polyglots report that they have to spend hours every day in a sort of maintenance mode, rotating through their languages to keep the pathways fresh. It is like being an elite athlete. You cannot just reach peak fitness and then stop training. If a marathon runner stops running for 6 months, they lose that edge. The same happens with the polyglot brain.
I wonder about the left inferior frontal gyrus, which people often call Broca's area. Is that where the magic happens for these folks? I have heard that is the seat of speech production.
It is definitely a key player. Broca's area is involved in speech production and complex syntax. In polyglots, this area often appears more efficient. Interestingly, some studies suggest that when a polyglot is using a language they are highly proficient in, their brain actually shows less activity in certain regions than a beginner would. It is more streamlined. The beginner's brain is working overtime, firing all over the place trying to find the right word, while the polyglot's brain is like a well-oiled machine. It is the neural efficiency hypothesis. They are getting more output for less metabolic input.
So it is a matter of neural efficiency. But that brings up the question of the critical period hypothesis. We have all heard that if you do not learn a language as a child, you will never be truly native level. The window closes at puberty, or so the theory goes. Yet, many famous polyglots started their journey as adults. How does that square with the biology?
The critical period is definitely real in terms of phonology, which is the ability to perceive and produce sounds without an accent. If you start after puberty, it is very difficult to sound like a native because the brain's ability to distinguish between subtle phonemes starts to lock in early. But in terms of syntax, vocabulary, and deep conceptual understanding, the adult brain remains remarkably plastic. Polyglots often develop superior meta-linguistic awareness. They understand the mechanics of how language works, the how and why of grammar, which allows them to bootstrap new languages much faster than a child who is just absorbing it through immersion. They are not just learning a language, they are learning how to learn.
It is like they have a blueprint for how a language is built, so when they see a new one, they just have to fill in the specific blocks rather than inventing the concept of a block from scratch. Let's talk about some of the people who actually did this. You mentioned some historical cases earlier. Who is the gold standard for hyper-polyglotism?
If we are talking about historical heavyweights, we have to start with Cardinal Giuseppe Mezzofanti. He was an Italian priest in the 19th century, and his story is almost hard to believe. Reports from his time suggest he spoke at least 38 languages fluently, and some accounts put the number closer to 70 if you count dialects. He lived in Bologna and later Rome, and he was basically a human Google Translate before electricity existed.
38? That is incredible. Was he ever actually tested, or is this just legend? People back then were prone to a bit of hyperbole.
There were actually several people who traveled to Rome specifically to debunk him. They would bring speakers of obscure languages or rare dialects to meet him, and he would reportedly switch between them effortlessly. There is a famous story where he learned a new language overnight just to hear the confession of 2 foreign prisoners who were scheduled for execution the next morning. He spent the night with a grammar book and a dictionary, and by morning he was able to provide them with their last rites in their native tongue.
That is an amazing example of the human spirit, but also a terrifying display of cognitive speed. To learn enough of a language overnight to perform a religious rite? That suggests a very specific type of brain. Do we know if there are any downsides for him? Sometimes people with these extreme abilities struggle in other areas. It is that savant trade-off we sometimes see.
It is interesting you asked that. Mezzofanti was described as having a very kind and humble personality, but some observers noted that he did not seem to have much to say of his own original thought. He was a brilliant mirror. He could reflect any language perfectly, but he was not necessarily a great philosopher or a writer of original literature. It was as if the entirety of his cognitive energy was dedicated to the vessel of language rather than the content. He could say, "The sky is blue," in 70 languages, but he might not have had a profound new theory about why the sky is blue.
That is a profound trade-off. It reminds me of what we discussed in episode 819 about the 2E brain, where brilliance in one area can sometimes come at the cost of executive function or social processing elsewhere. Although in Mezzofanti's case, it seems his executive function was actually hyper-tuned for language switching. He was a specialist in the highest sense.
Right? And he is not the only one. Think about someone like Nikola Tesla. Most people know him for the alternating current and his rivalry with Edison, but he was also a significant polyglot. He spoke 8 languages fluently: Serbo-Croatian, Czech, German, French, English, Italian, Hungarian, and Latin. For Tesla, this was not just a hobby, it was a necessity for his work in a polyglot Europe.
That actually makes a lot of sense, given how he described his mental process. He claimed he could visualize entire machines in his head, down to the last screw, and run them for weeks to see where they would wear out. If you have that kind of high-fidelity mental simulation capability, learning the patterns of a language might just be another form of system modeling. He was seeing the gears of the grammar turning.
For Tesla, language was likely just another system of rules and structures. And speaking of people with a strategic need for language, we should mention Cleopatra. She is often portrayed in movies as a sort of seductress, but her real power was her intellect and her linguistic range. She was the first member of the Ptolemaic dynasty to actually bother learning the Egyptian language. Her family had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, but they were ethnically Greek and spoke Greek. They were essentially foreign occupiers who did not speak the language of the people they ruled.
That is a massive political advantage. If you can speak to your subjects and your neighbors in their own tongue, you have a level of rapport and intelligence, gathering capability that an interpreter can never fully replicate. We talked about this in episode 933 when we looked at the high stakes of interpretation. There is always a filter when you use a third party. They can soften the blow or miss the nuance. Cleopatra removed the filter.
She really did. Cleopatra reportedly spoke at least 9 languages, including Hebrew, Ethiopic, Syriac, and Median. She could negotiate with kings and commoners alike. It is a great example of language as a tool for statecraft. In our context, being here in Israel, we see this all the time. The ability to understand the nuances of what is being said in a neighboring country's media or by their leadership in their own language is a massive strategic asset. It is why our intelligence services place such a high premium on linguistic expertise. You cannot understand a culture if you are only reading the subtitles.
It is a form of respect, but also a form of power. Now let's look at the cognitive ceiling. Daniel asked if there is a limit to how many languages a human can know simultaneously. If Mezzofanti could do 38, is that the hard cap? Or is it more about the linguistic distance between the languages?
That is a crucial point. Linguistic distance is the measure of how different 2 languages are. If you already speak Spanish, learning Italian or Portuguese is relatively easy because the underlying structure and a huge chunk of the vocabulary are the same. You are just learning a new dialect, essentially. You are building on existing neural scaffolding. But if an English speaker tries to learn Mandarin or Arabic, they are starting from a much more distant point. They have to learn new writing systems, new tonal structures, and entirely different ways of conceptualizing time and relationship.
Right. So a person who speaks 12 Romance languages is impressive, but perhaps less cognitively stretched than someone who speaks 5 languages from completely different families, like English, Mandarin, Arabic, Finnish, and Quechua. One is like playing 12 variations of the same song on a piano. The other is like playing 5 different instruments simultaneously.
Definitely. The working memory ceiling is the real bottleneck. Working memory is the scratch pad of the brain where we hold information temporarily while we process it. Most researchers believe that for the average person, the limit is not necessarily the number of languages, but the amount of time available for maintenance and the interference effect. Interference is where the more languages you know, the more they begin to compete. If you are trying to find the word for table in German, and your brain offers you the word in French, Russian, and Japanese first, your processing speed drops.
It is the search cost. As the database gets larger, the query takes longer. Is there any data on the average person? If we were all given the best tools and infinite time, how many could we realistically hold?
Some linguists suggest that most people could manage between 3 and 5 languages with high proficiency if they were immersed in them. Beyond that, you start to see a decline in the quality of the weaker languages. It becomes a zero-sum game. To get better at your 6th language, you might have to sacrifice some of the nuance in your 3rd. It is like a garden. You can only tend so many plants before some of them start to wither from neglect.
That makes me think about the modern tools we have. We mentioned earlier that we live in the era of artificial intelligence and translation. Does that make the effort of becoming a polyglot obsolete, or does it change the goal? If I have an earbud that can translate Mandarin for me, why spend 10 years learning it?
I think it changes the goal. If you just need to know where the bathroom is or how much a taxi costs, use the app. But language is about more than data transfer. It is about how you perceive the world. There is that famous quote, often attributed to Charlemagne, that to have a second language is to have a second soul. Different languages force you to categorize reality in different ways. Some languages have no future tense, which changes how speakers think about planning. Some have dozens of ways to describe social hierarchy. When you learn those, you are expanding your cognitive toolkit. You are not just getting a new way to say the same things, you are getting new things to say.
I love that idea. It is like adding more colors to your palette. You can see things you literally did not have the words for before. And that brings us to the practical side of this. For our listeners who are not hyper-polyglots, but want to add a second or third language, what are the actual takeaways from how these masters do it? Because they clearly have a system.
The first big takeaway is the input hypothesis, which was popularized by Stephen Krashen. The idea is that we do not learn language by studying grammar rules in a vacuum. We acquire it by understanding messages. He calls this comprehensible input. You need to be exposed to language that is just one level above your current understanding, what he calls I+1. If it is too easy, you do not learn. If it is too hard, it is just noise. Polyglots spend a lot of time finding content that is just challenging enough.
So, instead of memorizing verb tables, I should be watching a show or reading a book where I understand about 80% of what is happening?
Your brain is a pattern recognition machine. If you give it enough data with enough context, it will figure out the grammar on its own, just like you did as a child. The second takeaway is the use of spaced repetition systems, or SRS. This is a method of reviewing information at increasing intervals. Polyglots use apps like Enki to make sure they are reviewing a word right at the moment they are about to forget it. It is the most efficient way to move something from short-term to long-term memory. It hacks the forgetting curve.
That sounds like a way to hack the language attrition we talked about. You are essentially telling your brain, no, do not prune this connection yet, I still need it.
Precisely. And the third tip is to leverage language families. If you want to learn multiple languages, start with ones that are related. If you learn German, Dutch becomes much easier. If you learn Hebrew, you have a massive head start on Arabic because the root system of the words is very similar. You are building on existing neural scaffolding rather than starting from zero every time. It is about being a smart engineer of your own brain.
That is a very conservative, practical approach to learning. Use what you already have to build what you want. I also think there is something to be said for the psychological barrier. A lot of people are afraid of looking stupid or making mistakes. But every polyglot I have ever met says that you have to be willing to be a fool for a while. You have to be okay with speaking like a child before you can speak like an adult.
That is so true. In fact, there is some research suggesting that people with lower levels of language anxiety actually have more efficient neural processing in their language centers. When you are stressed, your amygdala kicks in. That is the fight or flight center, and it can actually inhibit the parts of your brain responsible for language production. So, being relaxed and confident is literally a biological advantage. If you are laughing at your own mistakes, you are actually learning faster.
So, the secret to being a polyglot is part biology, part strategy, and part just having a thick skin. It is fascinating to think about how this will evolve. You mentioned the metabolic cost and the maintenance cost. Do you think we will ever see a day where we can just bypass the learning process? Like a direct neural interface that gives us the structures of a new language? We are seeing Neuralink and other companies making strides in 2026.
It is a popular science fiction trope, but language is so deeply integrated into our entire neural architecture. It is not just a file you can upload to a folder. It is woven into our memories, our emotions, and our sensory perceptions. When I say the word apple, I am not just accessing a definition. I am accessing the smell, the taste, and the memory of the first time I ate one. I think we might get better at the translation side, but the true experience of being a polyglot, of thinking in another language, is likely always going to require that period of neural adaptation. You have to grow those connections.
I think you are right. There is no shortcut for growth. It is like exercise. A machine can move your legs for you, but it won't make your muscles stronger. You have to do the work to get the benefit. The struggle is actually what creates the capability.
Well said. And I think that is a good place to start wrapping this up. We have looked at the extreme cases like Mezzofanti and Tesla, the strategic brilliance of Cleopatra, and the actual brain structures that make it all possible. It turns out that while some people might have a head start biologically, the path to being a polyglot is largely one of discipline, smart strategy, and a willingness to engage with the world in a different way.
It is an encouraging thought. We might not all be able to speak 38 languages, but the human brain is clearly capable of so much more than most of us give it credit for. If you are listening to this, and you have been putting off learning that language you have always been interested in, maybe today is the day to start. Just remember to find that comprehensible input, and do not be afraid to sound a bit silly at the start.
And if you have managed to learn a second or third language, or if you are one of those rare hyper-polyglots yourself, we would love to hear about your experience. What does it feel like when your brain switches gears? Do you feel like a different person? You can reach out to us through the contact form on our website.
Definitely. We always love hearing from you guys. And before we go, if you've been enjoying my weird prompts, please take a moment to leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It really does help the show reach more people who are interested in these kinds of deep dives. We are trying to grow this community of curious minds.
It genuinely makes a huge difference for us. You can find all of our past episodes, including the ones we mentioned today about memory and interpretation, at myweirdprompts.com. We have a full archive there and an RSS feed for subscribers.
Thanks to Daniel for the prompt today. It definitely gave us a lot to think about while we look out at the multilingual streets of Jerusalem. It makes me want to go out and try to pick up a few more words of Arabic before dinner.
It sure did. This has been My Weird Prompts. I am Herman Poppleberry.
And I am Corn. We will see you next time.
Until next time.
Actually, before we fully sign off, Herman, I was thinking about one more thing. We talked about the political and strategic side of this. In the United States and other Western countries, there has been a lot of discussion about the decline of foreign language study in universities. From a conservative perspective, do you see that as a concern for national security or cultural strength?
Oh, absolutely. It is a major concern. If you look at the greatest generations of American diplomats and intelligence officers, they were often deeply immersed in the languages and cultures of the regions they were dealing with. When we lose that, we become dependent on translated summaries, which often miss the cultural subtext or the emotional weight of what is being said. To lead on the world stage, you have to be able to communicate, not just broadcast. You have to be able to hear what is not being said.
Right. It is about understanding the heart of your allies and the mind of your adversaries. It is a form of intellectual readiness. If we want to maintain our position and protect our interests, we need people who can navigate those linguistic landscapes without a map. It is about being grounded in reality, not just in our own echo chambers.
Language is the ultimate reality check because it forces you to acknowledge that other people have entire systems of meaning that are different from your own. It humbles you.
Well, I think that adds a really important layer to why this matters. It is not just a hobby, it is a vital skill for a functioning society in a complex world.
Agreed. All right, now we can really let them go.
Fair enough. Thanks for listening, everyone. We will be back soon with another prompt.
Take care.
You know, Herman, I was just thinking about the sheer volume of words we have put out over 1,027 episodes. If we had spent all that time learning a new language instead of talking about weird prompts, we might be hyper-polyglots by now. We have probably spoken enough words to fill a small library.
Speak for yourself, Corn. I have been learning ancient Sumerian in my spare time. It is a bit niche, but the grammar is fascinatingly logical.
Of course you have. I should have known. Is it coming along? Can you order a barley beer in a Sumerian tavern yet?
Let's just say the cuneiform is a bit of a challenge for my hooves, but I am making progress. The clay tablets are a bit messy, but the syntax is surprisingly modern in some ways.
I will stick to English and the occasional bit of Hebrew. It is enough for a sloth like me. I prefer my languages to be spoken by people who are still alive.
It is plenty. See you later, brother.
See you later, Herman.
And thanks again to everyone for tuning in to My Weird Prompts. We really appreciate you being part of this journey with us. Whether you have been here since episode 1 or you are just joining us now at episode 1027, it means a lot. We are honored to be in your ears.
It really does. We have a lot more ground to cover, so stay tuned. The world is full of weird things to explore, and we are not stopping anytime soon.
And we are just getting started. Goodbye for now.
Oh, goodbye.
One last thing, Corn. Did you know that the word for donkey in several ancient languages is actually an onomatopoeia for the sound they make? It is one of the few words that stays consistent across linguistic families.
I did not, but somehow I am not surprised you do. We will save the linguistics of animal sounds for another day. I am sure there is a whole episode in that.
Looking forward to it.
Me too. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Seriously, Herman? 38 languages? I can barely remember where I put my keys half the time. I have to call my own phone just to find it in the couch cushions.
Well, maybe if you labeled your keys in 38 different languages, you would have a better chance of spotting them. You could have a French key, a Russian key, a Japanese key.
I think that would just make it 38 times more confusing. I would be standing at the door trying to remember if this was a key or a Klayuk or a Kagi.
Fair point. Let's go get some coffee. I think I know how to order in at least 3 languages now, so we should be safe regardless of who is behind the counter.
Lead the way. I am buying.
I will hold you to that.
I know you will.
My Weird Prompts is recorded in Jerusalem. You can find us online at myweirdprompts.com.
And on Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone.
We are out.
Out.
Really out this time.
Indeed.
One more thing.
Corn. The listeners are going to think we are stuck in a loop.
I just wanted to say that if anyone out there is a polyglot and has a weird trick for learning, like sleeping with a dictionary under their pillow or only watching cartoons in Finnish, they should definitely send it in. I am genuinely curious.
Agreed. Send those tips in. Okay, now we are done.
Done.
Goodbye.
Bye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts.